So this unequal power relations, leaves African countries in a situation where they can really defend their interest. They can't defend the interest. Then some of the external triggers, we always rely on IMF and the World Bank for policy advice, but history has proven that some of their policies have been inconsistent and have really failed, to lift African countries out of poverty and underdevelopment. We always take their policy advice to find out that they are always lawfuls, and also lawfuls probably due to the nature of the international financial architecture as well, that caters for individual and group interest rather than for the common interest. When I talk about common interest, I'm talking about the interest of the citizenry. Yes, the issues of complex interest, which I've already mentioned. And then, now, what have been the interventions thus far? We spoke about HIPIC and MTRI. These initiatives came and went, but just two decades after these initiatives, African countries are back to a pre-HIPIC situation. We have had the debt service suspension initiative, we have had the G20, and we're recently talking about SDRs, to help African countries get back on their feet. But in the light of the AFCON, on debt and development and its Harare Declaration, these initiatives do not go far to address the structural and systemic issues of the global debt architecture. And among some of these issues are problems of lack of transparency, accountability, and governance, which I already mentioned. There's lack of meaningful participation of citizens and all stakeholders in the debt contraction process, which I think is a central issue, in this conference, and that is why it's a multi-stakeholder conference. There is weak public finance management practices that make debt susceptible to misuse. And then let's look at the special drawn rights very briefly. This is one opportunity at which we of the civil society are very excited. Governments are very excited. Development partners are very excited about this opportunity, which is a welcome idea. And so far, $650 billion has been allocated, of which only 5% will come to African countries. And even within the 5%, it's unevenly distributed across the continent, which speaks about issues of inequality at the African level and at the global level. There is the option of rechanneling these SDRs from the rich countries who benefited the most to rechannel it, for the interest of, the developing countries in Africa. But there is a problem here because this rechanneling is also tied with conditionalities and the interest of, the partner countries or partner organizations doing the rechanneling. And then when you look at the issues of special drawing rights, it is important to acknowledge some of the inefficiencies around it, because first, it's useful only to countries that are out of debt distress. So when you look at the countries in red, these are countries that are either in high debt distress or in the risk of falling into high debt distress, which means SDRs to these countries might not be a very, very useful tool. Of course, it's going to solve maybe some of their liquidity problems, but then it's not going to address the overall structural issues, that these countries are faced with, and which, has put them in a very tight situation when it comes to issues of addressing their ability, to service their debts, and as well as to take care of their development needs. So apart from this, there are many more efficiencies around the SDRs, which means in as much as we welcome the SDRs and then we want to put into proper use, we should know that this is not the silver bullet, to the problems that African countries are faced with. So generally, we can say that the causes of Africa's public debt problems requires, us to engage in a holistic analysis. We can't apportion it to maybe internal or external issues. It's a combination of all. So it's neither internal or external triggers. So the problem should be viewed comprehensively, and policy suggestions should follow the same direction. And then we have spoken about Africans being able to take the position of a rule maker. It is important that moving on, Africans should have a voice where they can be rule makers, not just rule takers. I think we have already highlighted this, and this has came out as one of the major issues during the AFCOT, and one important consideration it is one important consideration for the discussions during the 3 days that we shall be here to, for the 3 days that we shall be here to discuss, the debt situation in Zimbabwe. Some of the policy suggestions that we have put through are found in the African Borrowing Charter. What is it that African governments can do to already start taking the responsibility to address, their debt problems? Africa has done this within the framework of the African Borrowing Charter, which talks about the need for a good legal framework, that instruct government actors and civil society actors and every other stakeholder what they are supposed to do, regarding issues of public debt management. It emphasizes issues of transparency and accountability, adequate management and monitoring of debt levels, avoid incidences of overborrowing, African government taking their responsibility, for financial prudence, and many more issues as you can find on this charter, which is available online. We also need to consider curbing illicit financial flows, because this is one of the problems that African countries are faced with. In fact, the major problem, issues of illicit financial flows and evasive tax practices, which do not allow or give African countries the opportunity, to mobilize the resources that they require to finance their development process. The need for sound investment choices. Government should not just borrow because they want to borrow. And governments have a responsibility to play here. And one other important thing is the uptake of policies, because sometimes it's not because we lack good policies, but it is because governments are slow to take up these policies, or the actors involved are slow to take up these policies, because this definitely plays with their interest, as we saw from the beginning of this presentation. So putting our place in a position where we take up policy suggestions can greatly improve, the current debt situation in African countries. Externally, we need to look towards a more balanced global relations that take into account the common interest. Development cooperation on a win-win basis is very important. I'm sure this is one thing that has been lacking. And one thing that we need to emphasize is North-South relations between the people, the governments, and the multinational corporations. I think it's very important for us to consider those relations on a win-win basis. Debt cancellation will always come, and debt restructuring will always come. And especially at this point, it's not a matter of whether we want it, it's a question of how we want it at this point. Then we need international frameworks for addressing issues of bankruptcy, and that is one thing that we lack, as well as the involvement of the private creditors in these discussions, because They are becoming an important actor that can no longer be ignored. This also includes, new and emerging lenders like China, India, and the other countries, the other newcomers on the debt creditor landscape. So, in light of the AFCOT, and in line with the Harare Declaration that came out of the AFCOT, there is the need at the national, regional, global, and global levels to push for a reformed global debt architecture in a manner that equalizes the loan contraction processes. This is very important. This is very important in the fact that it shouldn't be about one of the actors being dictated upon. There should be some balance in the power relations in how these loans are negotiated. African governments also need to lead in developing a common African position and consensus on sovereign debt, and definitely seek to overcome once and for all the distressed nature of sovereign debt. Governments also need to work with their national legislatures to strengthen national legal frameworks. This comes back to the issue of the African Borrowing Charter, which I mentioned earlier, and which is one important document that AFRODAT has put out there as one of the key things that African governments should look at when they want to, when it comes to issues of public debt management. So there needs to be national legal framework to ensure transparency and accountability, for sovereign debt negotiations, borrowing, and management of funds as stated in the African Borrowing Charter. There is also need to adopt, as part of alternative approaches, a feminist lens to economic research and analysis, as well as the formulation of policies. I think this is very important because we can all acknowledge the fact that, the Sustainable Development Goals call for us to leave no one behind, and leaving no one behind means the interest of women who have, whose interests have been neglected, who have been sidelined and discriminated upon for a long time. They need to be considered in terms of the economy, in issues of economic research and analysis, and in the kind of policies that African governments, the kind of policies that they make. There is need also to reclaim the social contract that embodies the relation between the citizen and the state, and where power lies with the people as right holders, and accountability becomes the responsibility of state as the duty bearer. This is very important. I mentioned issues of state capture when we saw the interest, the triangle earlier, where you have powerful people in government, groups that, have taken over the government or have done what we call state capture, and then the government, in that instance, you find the government that is no longer accountable to the people. And this is a very big problem in African countries. And this is one of the internal issues that need to address. And it is one of the responsibilities that African governments need to take. Because I think it is by taking responsibility that African governments will be able to put themselves out there as a rule maker rather than a rule taker. Because if we don't take that responsibility, no one will give us the opportunity to be on the table. So, generally, this has been, an overview of what the debt burden in Africa is and issues related to the political economy of this debt burden, which I believe should also open up the space as we have discussions during this Zimbabwe multi-stakeholder debt conference in the next 3 days. So I really look forward to an exciting exchange and to learn more and to share views that will enable us, come up with sound recommendations that can help to resolve the current debt burden that Zimbabwe and other African countries are faced with. Thank you so much for this opportunity, and do have very fruitful deliberations during the conference. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Theophilus. I think at this stage, we'll break for tea. 20 minutes. It's 20 past, so we should come back at 20 to 11. Thank you. So tea is just...
people first. You and I are the people to hold our governments to account. You and I are the people to hold our governments to account. We are the champion. 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 We are the champions. We call governments to commit to an economic system that shares value more equally, that is sustainable for the future of humanity and the planet, and that serves the people. for policies and practices that put people first. You and I are the people to hold our governments to account. You and I are the people to hold our governments to account. We are the champion. 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 We are the champions. Increased risky borrowing by African countries. A debt crisis, increasing poverty, inequality. Our governments borrow and we pay without involving us. Vana vamasiya agogo kalamba anyamada kusawan chito. We call for policies and practices that put people first. We call for policies and practices that put people first. You and I are the people to hold our governments to account. You and I are the people to hold our governments to account. We are the champion. 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 We are the champions. Lack of transparency, accountability, unsustainable loans. Street children, increasing crime and survival for the fittest. Increased burden on women, girls, and people with disability. Vana vamasiya agogo kalamba anyamada kusawan chito. We call for policies and practices that put people first. We call for policies and practices that put people first. You and I are the people to hold our governments to account. You and I are the people to hold our governments to account. We are the champion. 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 We are the champions. We call governments to commit to an economic system that shares value more equally, that is sustainable for the future of humanity and the planet, and that serves the people. We are the champion. 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 We are the champions. We call for policies and practices that put people first. We call for policies and practices that put people first. You and I are the people to hold our governments to account. You and I are the people to hold our governments to account. We are the champion. 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 We are the champions. people first. You and I are the people to hold our governments to account. You and I are the people to hold our governments to account. We are the champion. 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 We are the champions. We call governments to commit to an economic system that shares value more equally, that is sustainable for the future of humanity and the planet, and that serves the people. We are the champion. 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 We are the champions. We call for policies and practices that put people first. We call for policies and practices that put people first. You and I are the people to hold our governments to account. You and I are the people to hold our governments to account. We are the champion. 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 We are the champions. Increased risky borrowing by African countries. A debt crisis, increasing poverty, inequality. Our governments borrow and we pay without involving us. Vana vamasiya agogo kalamba anyamada kusawa nchito. We call for policies and practices that put people first. We call for policies and practices that put people first. You and I are the people to hold our governments to account. You and I are the people to hold our governments to account. We are the champion. 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 We are the champions. Lack of transparency, accountability, unsustainable loans. Street children, increasing crime and survival for the fittest. Increased burden on women, girls, and people with disability. Vana vamasiya agogo kalamba anyamada kusawa nchito. We call for policies and practices that put people first. We call for policies and practices that put people first. You and I are the people to hold our governments to account. You and I are the people to hold our governments to account. We are the champion. 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 We are the champions. We call governments to commit to an economic system that shares value more equally, that is sustainable for the future of humanity and the planet, and that serves the people. We are the champion. 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 policies and practices that put people first. You and I are the people to hold our governments to account. You and I are the people to hold our governments to account. We are the champion. 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 We are the champions. Increased risky borrowing by African countries. Aid crisis, increasing poverty, inequality. Our governments borrow and we pay without involving us. Vana vamasiya agogo kalamba anyamada kusawa nchito. We call for policies and practices that put people first. We call for policies and practices that put people first. You and I are the people to hold our governments to account. You and I are the people to hold our governments to account. We are the champion. 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 We are the champions. Lack of transparency, accountability, unsustainable loans. Street children, increasing crime and survival for the fittest. Increased burden on women, girls, and people with disability. Vana vamasiya agogo kalamba anyamada kusawa nchito. We call for policies and practices that put people first. We call for policies and practices that put people first. You and I are the people to hold our governments to account. You and I are the people to hold our governments to account. We are the champion. 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 We are the champions. We call governments to commit to an economic system that shares value more equally, that is sustainable for the future of humanity and the planet, and that serves the people. We are the champion. 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 We are the champions. We call for policies and practices that put people first. We call for policies and practices that put people first. You and I are the people to hold our governments to account. You and I are the people to hold our governments to account. We are the champion. 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 policies and practices that put people first. We call for policies and practices that put people first. You and I are the people to hold our governments to account. You and I are the people to hold our governments to account. We are the champion. 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 We are the champions. Lack of transparency, accountability, and sustainable loans. Straight children.
from table to table. Just plus your name and which institution you are representing. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is David from the Daily News.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Honorable Show, the Member of Parliament for the Banana constituency. I'm a member of the Thank you.
Morning,
everyone. My name is Victoria Makanza. I am the Midland State Executive and the coordinator for the Center for Public Policy.
Good morning, Edwin representing the Zimbabwe member of the Parliament as well as part in Parliament.
Morning to you all. My name is Edmund, MP for Shurubi South constituency. Good morning, everyone. My name is Madondo. I'm from Zimbabwe.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Shania Rabi. I'm with the Zimbabwe Coalition on Development. Thank you.
Morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Morning, everyone.
My name is
Zimbabwe Coalition on Development.
Morning, colleagues. Morning, everyone. I'm Chidwadi, one of Parliament from Tessa North constituency, and I'm a member of DAC.
Good morning, everyone. James I represent and I'm also
Good morning.
Good morning. My name is Robita Makoni. I'm the Women's Rights and Economic Justice Manager for Action Zimbabwe.
My name is David Mangwere. I am an academic who teaches at Africa University.
Good morning. Good morning. My name is William Otelo Chikupa. I'm an MP in Harare and the chairperson of the Economics in National Housing.
Good morning. Good morning.
Good morning.
I'm Rachel Sila from Midland State University, Department of Development Studies.
Good morning. My name is Masimba Manyanya. I'm of Zimbabwe.
Mamgasi, President in the Social Economic Justice Ambassador, also addressing the alliance students in basic financial fraud and the impacts of domestic.
Good morning, everyone. Congratulations for the Africa.
Good morning.
Good morning. My name is Munyama Tarase. I'm the Evangelical Fellowship of Zimbabwe.
Good morning.
Good morning. I'm Murai Samu and I'm from Nango. I'm the General Secretary for the Evangelical Fellowship of Zimbabwe. My name is Pastor Blessing Makwara.
Good morning.
Good morning. I'm Melissa Church from the day.
Good morning.
Good morning. My name is Judith Kaulem with the Poverty Reduction Forum Trust.
Good morning. My name is Masilo Chera with the Center for Disability Development and also Zimbabwe.
Okay, good
morning. My name is Edith Masawa for the Center for Disability Development. Greetings one and all. My name is Yolanda Philip. I'm a social and economic justice ambassador and I'm coming from
Good morning.
Good morning. My name is Philip Chitsika
from the
Infrastructure Development Bank of Zimbabwe.
Good morning.
Good morning. My name is Makina Morgan. I work in the Ministry of Management.
Good morning. My name is Enes Mapakam. I'm a journalist with Zim Papers Business Weekly.
Good morning. My name is Taswe Maches. I'm from Parliament. I'm a member of staff. Morning. I'm Chioniso Mataruka from Parliament of Zimbabwe.
Janet Joe. I'm with ZimCard. Thank you.
Gordon Moyo, Public Policy and Research Institute of Zimbabwe, PRIZ, also Lupane State University.
Victor Borom, Independent Economic Analyst, also joining CZRI. So I'm representing CZRI.
Good morning. I'm Alice Sanyika, Minister of Mines and Mining Development.
Mangwana Nakanak. My name is Len Munyamzanga. I'm an independent consultant, so passionate about tax issues.
A very good morning to you all. My name is Joseph Tinarwo from Great Zimbabwe University, the Department of Politics and Public Management.
Good morning. My name is Tawanda Znyama from University of Zimbabwe.
Good morning. My name is Tawanda Nikadzino from the Africa University Institute of Peace, Leadership and Governance.